She walked into the courtroom, a young woman with trembling hands and tired eyes, facing a system rigged against truth, and laughter echoed as she stood, mocked not just by the public, but by the very judge sworn to uphold justice. No one believed her. No one listened, until she spoke her final words. In a single, spine-chilling moment, the courtroom fell silent. Her revelation didn't just shake the walls of justice, it shattered them. The innocent walked free. The guilty were exposed. And the judge who laughed, he left in handcuffs. This isn't just a courtroom drama. It's a revolution wrapped in one voice. Chapter 1. The Entrance. The courtroom buzzed with whispers long before she arrived. Her name had been dragged through headlines, twisted into punchlines, dissected by strangers who had never once met her. Reporters speculated endlessly. Was she lying? Was she delusional? Or worse, was she trying to manipulate the justice system for attention? The gallery didn't come to witness justice. They came for entertainment. A young woman standing alone against the establishment? That was a spectacle they couldn't resist. The door opened, and all eyes turned. She didn't walk like a hero. She didn't dress like someone out to make a statement. No bold colors, no makeup armor. Just a plain shirt tucked into wrinkled slacks, a thin folder held tightly to her chest. Her steps were quiet, but every pair of eyes followed them like thunder. There was no defense team at her side. No one to whisper strategy. Just her and a truth no one seemed willing to believe. A man on the bench raised his brow, bored, impatient. This was beneath him, he had already decided. He wasn't here to listen. He was here to dismiss. This girl, just another attention seeker with a shaky voice and a mess of half-formed thoughts. He didn't need to hear her story. He already had the ending in his mind. And the gallery. They were there for the drama, not the justice. She could feel it in their smirks, in the way some leaned in as if expecting her to break down right there. Her hands clutched the folder tighter. From the corner, two bailiffs exchanged looks. Not the usual kind reserved for danger. This was amusement. She was a child in their eyes, a prop in a system that didn't pause for fragile voices. The accused sat nearby, his expression calm, calculated. He had the best lawyers in the city. He had reputation, wealth, and a judge who played golf with his father. The odds weren't just stacked. They were locked, loaded, and aimed. But she didn't shake. Not visibly. She stood still as her name was called, her presence somehow soft and unthreatening, yet impossible to ignore. There was something in her silence that unsettled them, something too calm for someone who should have been begging to be heard. The judge tapped his pen and sighed, signaling the clock to start ticking on her credibility. Somewhere in the back, a journalist whispered, "This'll be over quick." Another chuckled, "She looks terrified." Terrified. Maybe. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Something even she couldn't quite define. Not anger, not grief. Something deeper. A knowing. A steady pulse of certainty that refused to be swallowed by the noise. Her eyes didn't dart around. She didn't flinch when the chuckles got louder. She didn't crumble when the judge looked at her like she was wasting his time. She just stood there, waiting. Not for their approval. Not even for their attention. She waited for her moment. Not to plead, but to reveal. The prosecutor leaned over and whispered something into the judge's ear, and both chuckled under their breath. From the outside, it looked like confidence. But to her, it sounded like desperation disguised as arrogance. They weren't expecting to be challenged, not by someone like her. The air grew heavy with the kind of anticipation people feel just before a storm. Everyone expected her to fold. No one expected her to speak with clarity, but they didn't know what she held in that folder. They didn't know the months of silence she had endured, the sacrifices made, the truth uncovered, piece by painful piece. They thought they had the final word. They didn't realize. She was just getting started. Chapter 2. The Mockery. The moment she opened her mouth to speak, the interruptions began. The judge leaned back in his chair, adjusting his robe with a theatrical sigh, as if bracing himself for another waste of court time. Before she could finish her first sentence, the prosecutor raised an objection, not out of necessity, but out of habit, as though silencing her were part of the performance. The judge upheld it instantly, barely glancing her way. The gallery murmured again, louder this time. Some smirked. Others whispered jokes under their breath. A woman in the back shook her head and muttered something cruel to her neighbor. Phones were discreetly lifted, capturing the moment, not to document justice, but to catch another viral humiliation. It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a stage, and she had been cast as the fool. One of the defense attorneys rolled his eyes as she tried to correct a misstatement. He leaned into his microphone and asked the judge if they should pause for a moment, to allow the witness to collect her thoughts. Laughter, not just from the gallery, but from a few of the court officials who should have known better. She wasn't being questioned, she was being dismissed. Her credibility wasn't being tested, it was being erased. Her hesitation was used against her. Her pauses became inconsistencies. Her calmness was labeled calculating. Her emotion, when it appeared, was called manipulative. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, was twisted into something sinister. When she stood quietly, she was hiding something. When she spoke assertively, she was aggressive. There was no version of her that fit their idea of a credible witness. They hadn't come to listen. They had come to confirm what they already believed, that she didn't matter. The judge, meant to act as a neutral force, offered no protection. Instead, he scolded her for being unclear, for wasting time, and at one point, for getting emotional, though her voice hadn't risen once. He addressed her with the tone reserved for difficult children, condescending, impatient, and cold. When she tried to present a document from her folder, he waved it off without reading it, declaring it not compelling enough to pause proceedings. From the defense table, sarcastic remarks were made under breath, but loud enough to be heard. This is going to be good. Let her dig her own hole. The laughter wasn't hidden. It was allowed, encouraged even. The courtroom, a space that should have demanded dignity, had turned into a place where mockery held more weight than evidence. One of the lawyers even joked during a recess that they should give her a microphone and let her host a talk show. It earned a chorus of chuckles from court staff and observers alike. It wasn't just that she was being ridiculed, it was that her suffering had become entertainment. The double standard was blatant. When a male witness raised his voice, it was passion. When she did, it was hysteria. When others paused to collect themselves, it was human. When she paused, it was labeled as lying. She wasn't being evaluated as a person. She was being picked apart as a character in a story they thought they already knew. Every time she tried to return to the facts, they pulled her back into doubt. They weren't interested in her evidence, they were interested in undermining her confidence. Her education was questioned, her intentions were speculated on, her past was dragged in without context. They didn't need to disprove her, they only needed to make her feel small enough that she'd silence herself. And still, she stood. Not because she was being heard, but because she refused to disappear. The more they mocked, the more they revealed their own fear, not of her weakness, but of what she might be able to prove if she kept going. But they were too arrogant to see it. They thought they were silencing her. They didn't realize they were sharpening her voice. Chapter 3. The Testimony. She began with dates. Precise, unemotional, deliberate. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Just the truth. Documented, ordered, and delivered with care. No one leaned in to listen, yet no one could look away. The courtroom had expected stumbling and tears, but what they received instead was structure. She listed interactions, times, names, places. Every detail reinforced the last. There were no contradictions. Each point flowed into the next, not rehearsed but remembered. The evidence came slowly, not in a flood, but in waves. Email threads, screenshots, call logs, financial records. Most had never been reviewed. Some had been misplaced in the original investigation. Others were never submitted by the defense. Every document was linked to a claim. She wasn't asking the court to believe her. She was asking them to see what had been ignored. She connected conversations to transactions, faces to timelines, silences to cover-ups. Each step forward removed another brick from the wall of doubt that had been built around her. The judge, who had spent the first half of the session visibly dismissive, began to take longer pauses. He scanned pages more carefully. He stopped interrupting. The gallery was quiet, not because they had changed their minds, but because they couldn't deny what was unfolding. She wasn't falling apart. She was assembling a case that others had intentionally left fragmented. Her folder, once mocked as symbolic of desperation, became the center of gravity in the room. The defense objected more frequently now, not out of confidence, but to slow her momentum. It didn't work. She anticipated their moves. Every objection was met with calm reference to procedural rights. She had studied. She had prepared. She had been dismissed for too long not to be ready. She recounted a meeting, undocumented in court records, between the accused and a key investigator. The name of the investigator was known, but his presence at that meeting had never been disclosed. She submitted a parking receipt that placed him at the same location at the exact time she described. Then, a photo, time-stamped. The two men in conversation, unaware of the bystander who had captured them. It wasn't a dramatic reveal. It was quiet, but its impact was seismic. She moved on. Phone calls made after hours. Voicemails that had been deleted but retrieved through backup services. Conversations quoted word for word. She revealed an unfiled complaint by another woman, submitted and buried weeks before her own report. She had found her. They had compared timelines. Their stories aligned in chilling symmetry. By the time she presented the bank transfers, the courtroom was no longer breathing the same air. Transactions routed through charities tied to the accused. Money shifted between organizations within hours of her initial accusations. Labeled as donations, but sent with handwritten notes containing legal case numbers. She didn't point fingers. She pointed at facts, at dots. And then she connected them. Still, she never raised her voice. She didn't look for sympathy. She didn't even speak about pain. She spoke about patterns, systems, omissions. Her focus was always forward, not on how she had been mocked or what had been said about her, but on what had been missed, ignored, or hidden. She used their arrogance against them, not by attacking it, but by walking straight through it with proof. Every fact she laid out was one they could have found. Every document, one they had access to. But they didn't look, because they didn't listen. And now her voice was doing what their authority had failed to do, reveal the truth. She ended her testimony not with a plea, but with a question. Not to the court, but to the judge himself. One sentence, one line. A question about a decision he had signed off on. A decision that, when placed against the evidence she had just revealed, no longer made sense. And just like that, the silence in the room turned from disbelief to fear. Chapter 4. The Twist. The question she posed wasn't dramatic, but it cut deeper than any accusation. She asked why the judge had personally sealed a key piece of evidence just 3 days after it was submitted, evidence that directly contradicted the defendant's alibi. The court transcript reflected the date and the signature. No explanation had ever been required. No one had ever asked, until now. The silence in the courtroom wasn't from confusion. It was recognition. Everyone in that room knew what that question meant, even if they pretended otherwise. It wasn't an accusation. It was a spotlight. The judge shifted visibly, not because of pressure, but because he knew that others were now seeing what she had seen all along. A pattern of protection, a carefully choreographed delay. A decision that no longer looked procedural, it looked personal. She didn't accuse him directly. She simply placed the signature next to a series of private messages, extracted from a deleted email account between the judge and the defendant's legal team. One message, dated 1 day before the evidence was sealed, included the phrase, "We'll make sure it never sees light." Another included a reference to a private dinner that occurred the night before the sealing order was filed. The guest list, the judge, the defendant, 2 senior lawyers, no court-related justification. She presented a calendar screenshot, a guest reservation for 4 under a name linked to a judge-only dining club, a receipt, 4 entrees, 3 bottles of wine, a note scribbled on the back with case initials and a timestamp 3 hours after court had ended that day. There was no way to explain it as coincidence. The more she revealed, the less plausible denial became. Then came the audio clip. Short, crackly, just a few seconds long. A voicemail left on her burner phone weeks prior, assumed to be anonymous, but the voice was clear, and the words were unmistakable. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Walk away while you still can." A forensic specialist had traced the call to a prepaid device purchased at a convenience store 2 blocks from the courthouse. She submitted the report. The store's surveillance footage showed the buyer, a clerk who remembered the face. She showed the printed still frame to the courtroom. It wasn't the judge, but it was his clerk, and it was enough to collapse the illusion. Everything clicked. The sealed evidence, the rushed objections, the unusually fast dismissal of previous complaints, the convenient lack of evidence in an otherwise obvious trail. It all circled back, not just to the accused, but to the man presiding over the courtroom, the man who laughed when she spoke, the man who called her testimony theatrics, the man who had, until that moment, believed he was untouchable. She said nothing more about him. She didn't need to. The prosecution remained still. The defense froze. The gallery, once eager to scoff, now stared in rigid silence. No one moved. No one dared speak. The young woman who had been mocked and minimized had just turned the courtroom inside out, not with anger, not with drama, but with truth layered so meticulously that not even the most seasoned legal minds could dismantle it. She ended her presentation by placing a single document on the stand, a notarized statement, signed, dated, and witnessed by a former assistant to the judge, detailing years of inappropriate judicial conduct and case interference. It had been submitted before. It had been buried. But this time, it came attached to an official whistleblower complaint filed with a federal agency. She had timed the submission for that morning. The court was now obligated to act. The courtroom wasn't just shaken, it was undone. Every word she had spoken had led here. Not to vindication, not to applause, but to exposure. Not just of one corrupt man, but of a system that had underestimated the very person it tried to silence. And she had done it without raising her voice. Chapter 5. The Fallout. The silence in the courtroom did not fade. It deepened. No longer the silence of disbelief, but the kind born from undeniable truth. For the first time since proceedings began, no one smirked. No one whispered. The air shifted, heavy with the weight of consequences that could no longer be avoided. Authority figures who had once ignored her now exchanged glances, not of confidence but of fear. Fear of what had just been made public, fear of being connected to the wrong side of history. The court officers remained still, unsure whether to act or wait for orders. The clerk's face had gone pale. His image, caught on store surveillance, lingered in everyone's mind. It wasn't just his job in jeopardy. It was his freedom. The judge sat motionless, eyes fixed on the evidence that bore his signature. A man used to control, now cornered by documentation more powerful than his gavel. His lips parted, but no words followed. He understood what had just occurred. Everyone did. The prosecution whispered among themselves, suddenly animated. They weren't discussing how to attack her credibility anymore. They were asking how this happened under their watch. Their previous objections and disregard were now liabilities, and no one wanted to be the name remembered for siding with corruption. The defense, once smug and casual, no longer made eye contact with anyone. Their case had collapsed, not from poor strategy, but from the arrogance that no one would ever challenge them this completely. In the rear of the courtroom, 2 federal observers, previously unnoticed, stood up and left quietly. Not to leave, but to make calls. There was protocol to follow now. The whistleblower statement had triggered something larger, something that extended beyond the limits of this courtroom. Investigators would be dispatched. Internal reviews would begin. Everything the young woman had presented would now be re-examined through the lens of formal accountability. The judge attempted to call for recess, but the bailiff didn't move. Protocol had shifted. Until further notice, he was no longer in command. One of the court officers stepped aside to take instructions from outside the room. Radio silence broke into brief exchanges. Names, badge numbers, department heads. It wasn't chaos. It was a quiet transfer of control. The accused, still seated confidently just minutes before, now tapped nervously on the armrest of his chair. The foundation beneath him was gone. His legal team sat frozen, their usual bravado stripped away. The documents were real. The messages were real. The bank records, the photos, the statements, they were too numerous, too detailed, too precise to be discredited. The gallery watched, unsure of what to do with their silence. Those who had laughed now looked away. Those who had doubted shifted uncomfortably, confronted not just with their error, but with their complicity. She had stood there alone for hours, and now she stood as the reason the system was finally forced to answer for itself. Outside the courtroom, the news cycle exploded. Cameras rolled, journalists raced to rewrite their scripts. The story had changed. The narrative of a fragile, unreliable girl had been replaced with the reality of a whistleblower who dismantled a courtroom with documentation and resilience. Her name, once attached to rumors and ridicule, now carried weight. Inside, legal protocol took over. The judge was instructed to step down pending investigation. Court officers escorted him out, not as an authority figure, but as a subject of inquiry. The clerk followed, escorted by 2 federal agents. A hush followed their exit. Not applause, not celebration, just recognition. Chapter 6. The Legacy. The verdict wasn't just a conclusion, it was a beginning. The innocent man, wrongfully accused and nearly buried by the system, walked free, his name cleared, his dignity restored. But even his release wasn't the most talked-about outcome. It was the young woman's role in unraveling the injustice that captured the public's attention. What had started as a quiet, lonely act of resistance became a national reckoning. Within days, news outlets published timelines of the trial, not focusing on the courtroom drama, but on the precision and depth of her evidence. Legal experts dissected her testimony in televised panels, praising her command of data, her strategic pacing, and her unwavering composure under pressure. Journalists ran features on her background, her self-education, her hours spent researching judicial procedure, her determination to understand the law when it failed to understand her. Law schools began citing the case in ethics courses. The judge's fall from power sparked waves of internal reviews in judicial circuits across the country. Committees formed. Complaints previously dismissed were reopened. A new public consciousness emerged, not just about corruption, but about who is ignored when they try to speak up against it. Her story fueled debate in both legal and political spaces, with advocates calling for broader whistleblower protections, judicial oversight reform, and transparency in court procedures. But more powerful than policy shifts was the cultural ripple. Survivors and silenced voices found a rallying symbol in her resolve. Social media was flooded with messages of solidarity, not because she had won, but because she had endured. She became proof that being underestimated can be a weapon in disguise, that preparation, truth, and courage, when combined, can bend even the most rigid systems toward accountability. She never gave speeches. She turned down interviews. She didn't write a book. She didn't need to. The silence that had once been forced on her had become a choice. And in that silence, her impact deepened. Organizations quietly reached out to her for guidance. Activists credited her as a catalyst. Civil rights groups cited her case in amicus briefs. Universities awarded her honorary recognition, not because she sought prestige, but because her example demanded acknowledgement. The judge was formally disbarred. The investigation uncovered years of ethical violations, hidden connections, and biased rulings. Several of his past cases were reopened, leading to overturned convictions and financial reparations. His legacy, once cemented in law journals, became a case study in unchecked power and the consequences of systemic arrogance. The clerk accepted a plea deal. In exchange for cooperating with investigators, he confirmed what had long been suspected, that certain voices in courtrooms were dismissed not out of reason, but out of routine. That bias wasn't always loud. It often wore the mask of professionalism, procedure, and precedent. His confession didn't excuse his actions, but it exposed an institutional rot that many had long suspected, yet few could prove. The man she had defended chose to remain out of the spotlight. He credited her with saving his life, both literally and legally, but never tried to profit from the attention. His release was quiet, respectful, and healing. He became a volunteer for a foundation that supported the wrongfully convicted, honoring the fight that had cleared his name. Justice, even when served, remains imperfect. But the truth, when revealed with clarity and courage, becomes something stronger than a verdict. It becomes legacy. And hers was not one of victimhood, but of transformation, of a young woman who refused to accept silence, and in doing so, rewrote what justice could look like when truth is given room to breathe. Thanks for watching.